The church bells of Cedar Falls rang out across the mountain valley, but their cheerful bronze voices couldn't drown out the angry shouts echoing from inside the whitewashed building. Through the tall windows, the entire town could see shadows moving in heated argument, gestures flying, fingers pointing accusingly. Then the heavy oak doors burst open with such force they slammed against the outer walls, and Sarah Mitchell stumbled out, her face flushed with humiliation and fury. Before we jump back to discover how this extraordinary situation came to pass, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Behind her, Victoria Ashford's shrill voice cut through the crisp autumn air like a blade. Mark my words, that woman is a disgrace to decent society. No proper lady would even consider such an arrangement. The gathered crowd of townspeople pressed closer, their faces a mixture of scandalized delight and moral outrage. Some whispered behind gloved hands, others stared openly, but all watched as Sarah straightened her shoulders and walked with as much dignity as she could muster toward the edge of town, where 12 pairs of eyes waited anxiously beside a weathered mountain man, whose massive frame cast a shadow longer than any of the surrounding pine trees. Robert Thompson, known to everyone as Bear, stood perfectly still as Sarah approached, his weathered hands resting on the shoulders of his 2 youngest sons. His gray eyes, sharp as winter steel, took in every detail of her humiliated exit from the church, the whispered comments from the crowd, the way she held her head high despite the public shaming she had just endured. When she reached the group, he spoke in a voice that carried easily across the churchyard, low and steady as distant thunder. "I reckon that settles it then. You've heard what they think of you for even considering my proposal. Question is, what do you think?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity, broken only by the wind through the pine needles and the restless shifting of horses. Sarah looked at the 12 boys surrounding this mountain of a man, these children who had been without a mother's care for 3 long years, and something shifted deep in her chest. Not pity, but recognition. She knew what it meant to be alone, to face a world that offered judgment instead of helping hands. "I think," she said clearly, her voice carrying back to the crowd still gathered at the church, "that these boys need someone who will fight for them as fiercely as any mother would. And I think you're right, Mr. Thompson. You don't need a lady, you need someone with backbone." Bear's weathered face cracked into the first genuine smile the town had seen from him in years, and he nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed more approval than a dozen flowery speeches might have managed. 3 months earlier, Sarah Mitchell had arrived in Cedar Falls with nothing more than a worn carpet bag, 2 letters of recommendation from her previous employer, and the kind of quiet desperation that comes from having exhausted every other option. The stagecoach had deposited her in front of Garrett's General Store on a Tuesday morning, when the mountain mist still clung to the valleys like smoke, and she had stood there for a long moment, taking in the sight of what was to be her new home. Cedar Falls was the kind of town that existed because geography demanded it, perched at the confluence of 2 mountain streams where the old Indian Trail widened enough for wagons to pass safely through the rocky terrain. The main street ran exactly 4 blocks, lined with the essential establishments that kept frontier life functioning: the general store with its wide front porch and hand-painted signs advertising everything from lamp oil to ladies' corsets, the Silver Dollar Saloon, with its swinging doors and the perpetual sound of piano music drifting out onto the dusty street, the blacksmith's forge where the ring of hammer on anvil provided a steady rhythm to the town's daily activities, and the small white church that anchored the respectable end of town like a beacon of civilization in the wilderness. Sarah had secured lodging at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, a narrow 2-story building wedged between the bakery and the dress shop, where she rented a room barely large enough for a single bed, a washstand and a trunk for her belongings. The arrangement included 2 meals a day and laundry privileges, luxuries she had learned not to take for granted during the difficult months before her arrival in Cedar Falls. Mrs. Henderson, an angular woman with suspicious eyes and the demeanor of someone who had been disappointed by life more often than surprised by it, had made it clear from the first day that young women without family connections were expected to maintain the highest standards of moral behavior, or find themselves seeking accommodation elsewhere. The position Sarah had come to fill was that of school teacher, a role that had opened unexpectedly when the previous teacher, Miss Eleanor Pritchard, had married the bank manager and moved to Denver to live what everyone agreed was a much more suitable life for a woman of her education and refinement. The school itself was a single room built of local pine and chinked with mountain clay, furnished with rough-hewn desks that could accommodate perhaps 20 students when filled to capacity. A pot-bellied stove squatted in one corner, surrounded by a careful barrier of rocks to prevent any accidental contact between curious children and hot metal, while at the front of the room, a slate blackboard had been mounted on the wall with the kind of reverent care usually reserved for religious artifacts. Sarah's first week in Cedar Falls had passed quietly enough, spent preparing lessons, organizing the few textbooks available, and getting acquainted with the families whose children would be entrusted to her care. She discovered that the town's population included a surprising variety of people, from the refined merchant families who had established themselves early and built substantial homes on the hillside overlooking the main street, to the rough-edged miners and loggers who lived in simpler accommodations and measured their success by different standards entirely. Most of the children came from somewhere in between these extremes, the sons and daughters of storekeepers, craftsmen, small ranchers, and the various other folk who had found their way to this mountain valley and decided to stay. It was during her second week, while she was arranging primers and copybooks on the shelves that served as the school's library, that Sarah first heard mention of Bear Thompson and his 12 sons. The conversation drifted in through the open windows from the street outside, where two women had paused in their marketing to exchange the kind of gossip that fueled small-town social dynamics. "I saw him in town again yesterday," the first woman was saying, her tone carrying the particular mixture of disapproval and fascination that people reserve for discussing those who live outside conventional boundaries. "Came down from that mountain place of his with 4 of the older boys, bought supplies enough to last a month, and never said more than morning to anyone who greeted him. Well, what do you expect?" The second woman replied, her voice pitched to carry just far enough to ensure that anyone within earshot could follow the conversation. "Man's been living like a hermit up there since his wife passed. Those poor children running wild without a woman's influence, no proper schooling, no refinement whatsoever. It's a scandal really, but what can decent folk do? He won't accept help, won't bring them to church, won't even send them down to school." Sarah had continued organizing books while listening to this exchange, but something about the mention of children without schooling had caught her professional attention. She had become a teacher precisely because she believed in the transformative power of education, the way knowledge could open doors and create opportunities that might otherwise remain forever closed. The idea of 12 children growing up without formal learning troubled her in a way that had nothing to do with social convention and everything to do with wasted potential. Over the following days, she found herself asking careful questions about the Thompson family, gathering information piece by piece like a detective pursuing an important case. The picture that emerged was both tragic and intriguing. Bear Thompson had arrived in the Cedar Falls area some 15 years earlier, a young man with a pregnant wife, and the kind of determination that comes from having burned bridges behind you. He had claimed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Claimed a substantial piece of land high up on Pine Ridge Mountain, beyond where most folks considered it practical to establish a homestead, and had set about building not just a house but an entire self-sufficient operation. The work had been backbreaking, carving a life out of wilderness that fought back at every turn, but Bear had possessed the kind of stubborn strength that turned impossibility into mere difficulty. He had cleared fields, built barns, dug wells and established the kind of operation that could sustain a large family through the harsh mountain winters that regularly isolated the high country for months at a time. His wife, Maria, had been a gentle woman with dark eyes and a gift for growing things, according to those few townspeople who remembered her. She had borne him 12 sons in the span of 14 years, a feat that had earned both admiration and whispered concern from the women of Cedar Falls. The tragedy had struck 3 years ago, when a late spring fever had swept through the mountain communities with devastating efficiency. Maria Thompson had fallen ill on a Wednesday morning, been bedridden by Friday, and died the following Tuesday, leaving behind a husband whose world had just collapsed and 12 boys ranging in age from 14 down to a baby barely walking. The entire community had expected Bear to bring his children down from the mountain, to seek help from the town's families, to acknowledge that no man could raise 12 sons without assistance. Instead, he had buried his wife in the small cemetery he established on his own land, gathered his boys around him, and retreated even further into the mountain wilderness that had become both sanctuary and prison. Since then, sightings of the Thompson family had become increasingly rare events, worthy of comment and speculation whenever they occurred. Bear would appear in town perhaps once a month, always accompanied by several of his older sons, to purchase supplies and conduct whatever business required personal attention. He spoke politely but briefly to anyone who addressed him, paid his bills in cash, and departed with the same quiet efficiency that had marked his arrival. The boys who accompanied him were inevitably well-behaved and respectful, but they possessed a kind of reserve that suggested they had learned to guard their thoughts and feelings carefully. What troubled the townspeople most, particularly the women who considered themselves the guardians of proper moral standards, was not that Bear Thompson was raising his sons alone, but that he seemed to be doing it successfully. The boys appeared healthy, well-fed, and adequately clothed. They displayed the kind of practical competence that came from growing up in an environment where everyone contributed to the family's survival. Most unsettling of all, they seemed content with their unconventional circumstances, showing none of the restlessness or rebelliousness that might have justified outside intervention. Victoria Ashford, who had appointed herself the unofficial arbiter of social propriety in Cedar Falls, had made several attempts to organize assistance for the Thompson family, efforts that had been politely but firmly declined. She had proposed that the younger children be brought to town during the school months to board with appropriate families, an offer that Bear had thanked her for and ignored. She had suggested that qualified women from the community might visit the mountain homestead to provide domestic guidance and feminine influence, a proposal that had received no response whatsoever. Most frustrating of all, she had hinted that certain young women of good character might be willing to consider marriage arrangements that would provide the Thompson household with proper maternal supervision, only to be told that such assistance was neither needed nor desired. This last rejection had particularly stung, since Victoria had invested considerable effort in identifying suitable candidates and discussing their qualifications with other influential members of the community. The fact that Bear Thompson seemed perfectly content to continue his unconventional domestic arrangements struck her as a direct challenge to everything she believed about proper family structure and social order. A man, no matter how capable, simply could not provide the kind of guidance and nurturing that growing children required. The longer he persisted in his stubborn independence, the more damage he was potentially inflicting on 12 innocent souls who deserved better than such irregular circumstances. Sarah had listened to these various accounts with growing curiosity, partly professional and partly personal. As a teacher, she was naturally concerned about children who were not receiving formal education. As a woman who had herself experienced the challenges of making an unconventional life work, she found herself somewhat sympathetic to Bear Thompson's determination to solve his own problems rather than accepting assistance that came with expectations and obligations he might not be prepared to meet. Most intriguingly, as someone who had learned that survival sometimes required making choices that others might find incomprehensible, she wondered what kind of man could successfully manage such an enormous responsibility entirely alone. Her opportunity to satisfy some of this curiosity came during her 4th week in Cedar Falls, when she encountered 3 of the Thompson boys during one of her afternoon walks along Timber Creek. She had developed the habit of exploring the area around town during her free hours, partly to familiarize herself with the local geography, and partly because the mountain scenery provided a welcome contrast to the more confined urban environments where she had spent most of her adult life. The creek that gave the town its name wound through a series of meadows and wooded areas before joining the larger river that eventually carried its waters toward the distant plains, and Sarah had discovered several pleasant spots where she could sit and read or simply enjoy the peace of the mountain wilderness. On this particular afternoon, she had been following a faint trail that seemed to lead toward the higher elevations when she heard voices ahead, the unmistakable sounds of children at play. Curious, she had continued forward until she reached a clearing where the creek widened into a natural swimming hole, and there she had found 3 boys engaged in what appeared to be a serious discussion about the best method for constructing a fish trap. The oldest of the 3, who appeared to be perhaps 11 or 12 years old, was examining an arrangement of sticks and stones with the kind of concentrated attention that suggested this was important business rather than casual play. A younger boy, maybe 8 or 9, was offering suggestions that were being considered with respectful seriousness, while the youngest, who couldn't have been more than 6, was primarily occupied with skipping stones across the water's surface with the dedicated enthusiasm that children bring to perfecting any skill that captures their interest. Sarah had paused at the edge of the clearing, uncertain whether to announce her presence or quietly withdraw, when the oldest boy looked up and noticed her standing there. For a moment they regarded each other across the small meadow, both clearly surprised by the unexpected encounter. Then the boy straightened up, removed his hat in a gesture that spoke of careful training and proper manners, and addressed her with the kind of polite formality that adults often find both charming and slightly unsettling in young people. "Afternoon, ma'am. We didn't know anyone else used this spot. We can move along if we're disturbing you." The courtesy was clearly genuine, but Sarah detected an underlying wariness that suggested these children had learned to be cautious around strangers, particularly adults who might report their activities to parents or other authority figures. "Please don't leave on my account," Sarah replied, moving a few steps closer while being careful not to appear threatening or intrusive. "I was just walking and heard voices. I'm Sarah Mitchell, the new school teacher in town. I don't believe we've been introduced." The boys exchanged glances that conveyed some kind of silent communication before the oldest stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between his younger brothers and this unknown adult in a gesture that was protective without being obviously defensive. "I'm Caleb Thompson, ma'am. These are my brothers Isaac and Timothy. We live up on Pine Ridge." The name Thompson immediately connected these children to all the stories Sarah had been hearing, and she found herself studying them with increased interest. They were certainly healthy-looking boys, with the kind of tanned, sturdy appearance that came from spending most of their time outdoors engaged in physical activity. Their clothes were practical rather than fashionable, made of sturdy materials and clearly designed for hard use, but they were clean and well-mended. Most notably, they displayed the kind of self-possessed confidence that suggested they were accustomed to taking care of themselves and each other. "It's very nice to meet you," Sarah said, meaning it sincerely. "I've heard your father mentioned around town, though I haven't had the pleasure of meeting him yet. Are you boys enjoying your afternoon by the creek?" "Yes, ma'am," Caleb replied, relaxing slightly as it became apparent that this conversation was going to remain within safe conventional boundaries. "We're working on improving our fish trap design. Timothy caught 4 good-sized trout last week with the old version, but we think we can do better with some modifications." Sarah found herself genuinely impressed by the seriousness with which these children approached what most adults would consider recreational activity. "That sounds like practical engineering work. Have you been experimenting with different configurations?" The question seemed to surprise Caleb, as if he hadn't expected an adult to take his project seriously enough to inquire about technical details. "Yes, ma'am. We've been testing different spacing for the gaps and trying various materials for the funneling system. Isaac here has some ideas about using metal strips instead of just wooden slats." For the next 20 minutes, Sarah found herself engaged in a surprisingly sophisticated discussion about hydraulic principles, material properties, and design optimization, all conducted by children who might not have formal classroom education, but clearly possessed both practical intelligence and systematic thinking skills. Isaac proved to be particularly inventive, offering suggestions that demonstrated real understanding of how water flow patterns could be manipulated to achieve desired results. Even young Timothy contributed useful observations about fish behavior that informed their engineering decisions. What struck Sarah most forcefully was not just the technical competence these boys displayed, but the way they collaborated with each other. There was none of the competitive tension or hierarchical dynamics that often characterized interactions between brothers of different ages. Instead, they functioned as a team where each member's contributions were valued according to their merit rather than their source. Caleb clearly served as the leader, but he listened carefully to his younger brother's ideas and incorporated their suggestions when they proved useful. Eventually, the conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, and Caleb immediately became alert in a way that suggested this was a significant development. "That'll be Daniel coming to fetch us," he explained to Sarah. "We're supposed to be home before supper." Sure enough, 2 older boys appeared at the edge of the clearing, mounted on sturdy mountain horses and leading a third animal. The newcomers were clearly Thompson boys as well, sharing the same general physical characteristics and the same air of quiet competence. The older of the 2, who appeared to be in his middle teens, surveyed the scene with sharp eyes that took in every detail before settling on Sarah with polite but guarded interest. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, touching his hat brim in acknowledgement. "I'm Daniel Thompson. I hope my brothers haven't been bothering you." "Not at all," Sarah assured him. "We've been having a fascinating discussion about fish trap engineering. Your brothers are quite impressive young men." Something in Daniel's expression shifted subtly, as if this response was not quite what he had expected. "Thank you, ma'am. We should be heading home now though. Pa likes us all back before dark." The boys quickly gathered their equipment and prepared to depart, but before mounting their horses, Caleb turned back to Sarah with an expression of genuine curiosity. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what's it like being a school teacher? "Do you enjoy working with children?" The question caught Sarah somewhat off guard, partly because of its directness, and partly because it suggested these boys might be more interested in formal education than their father's rejection of town schooling would indicate. "I love it," she answered honestly. "There's something wonderful about helping young people discover new ideas and develop their natural abilities. Every child has unique talents that deserve to be nurtured and challenged." Caleb nodded thoughtfully, as if filing this information away for future consideration. "That sounds like important work. I hope you like it here in Cedar Falls." With that, the 5 boys departed, riding up the mountain trail with the easy confidence of people returning to familiar territory. Sarah watched them go with a mixture of admiration and puzzlement. These children were clearly thriving under their father's unconventional guidance, developing into capable, thoughtful young people despite their isolation from traditional educational and social structures. Yet she couldn't help wondering what additional opportunities they might pursue if they had access to formal learning and broader social experiences. More than that, she found herself intensely curious about the man who had produced such remarkable results under such challenging circumstances. Bear Thompson was obviously far more than the rough mountain hermit that town gossip suggested. Any father who could raise 12 sons to display such competence, courtesy and collaborative spirit possessed qualities that deserved both respect and investigation. Part 2. The desperate situation. Sarah's encounter with the Thompson boys had planted a seed of curiosity that grew stronger with each passing day. She found herself paying closer attention to conversations about the family, asking subtle questions about their circumstances, and wondering increasingly about the mysterious mountain man who had managed to raise 12 children in complete isolation from the conventional support systems that most families relied upon. Her professional interest as an educator had been piqued by the obvious intelligence and competence of the boys she had met, but there was something deeper at work as well, a personal recognition that she couldn't quite articulate even to herself. The recognition became clearer during her 6th week in Cedar Falls, when she received an unexpected visit from Dr. Emily Carter, the town's physician and one of the few people in the community whose opinions Sarah had come to value. Dr. Carter was a woman of perhaps 40 years with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the kind of steady, competent demeanor that inspired confidence in patients and colleagues alike. She had established her practice in Cedar Falls 5 years earlier, arriving with impressive credentials from medical colleges back east and the kind of determined independence that allowed her to thrive in an environment where most people still considered female physicians to be something of an oddity. Dr. Carter had stopped by the schoolhouse during Sarah's afternoon preparation time, ostensibly to discuss the health records of several students, but actually, as it turned out, to satisfy her own curiosity about the new teacher's background and intentions. After they had dispensed with the official business, the doctor had lingered, examining the classroom arrangements and teaching materials with the kind of attention that suggested genuine interest rather than mere politeness. "You've made remarkable improvements to this space, Dr. Carter observed, noting the carefully organized library corner, the maps and charts that decorated the walls, and the various educational materials that Sarah had acquired through her own resources when the town's budget proved inadequate. Miss Pritchard was a competent teacher, but she never showed this level of investment in her surroundings. Sarah had accepted the compliment graciously while wondering where this conversation might be leading. Dr. Carter had a reputation for directness that occasionally made other townspeople uncomfortable, but Sarah found it refreshing after weeks of navigating the subtle social currents that govern most interactions in a small community. "I suppose I believe that environment affects learning," Sarah replied. "Children respond better when they feel that their education is valued enough to merit proper attention and resources." Dr. Carter nodded approvingly. "A sound philosophy. I imagine you apply the same principle to your assessment of students individually, looking beyond surface appearances to identify real potential." The statement was delivered with the kind of pointed emphasis that suggested it was intended to convey more than its literal meaning. Sarah studied the doctor's face, noting the intelligent eyes and the slight smile that indicated some private amusement. "I try to," Sarah said carefully. "Every child deserves to have their abilities recognized and developed regardless of their background or circumstances." "An admirable attitude," Dr. Carter agreed, "one that might be particularly valuable in a community like ours, where unconventional situations sometimes produce unexpected results." She paused,
seemingly examining one of the arithmetic primers on Sarah's desk. "I understand you've had occasion to meet some of the Thompson boys." The sudden shift in topic confirmed Sarah's suspicion that this conversation had a specific purpose beyond casual socializing. "Yes, I encountered 3 of them during a walk along Timber Creek. Quite remarkable young men." "Indeed they are," Dr. Carter agreed warmly. "I've had professional dealings with the family over the years, and I can say without reservation that those children are among the most impressive I've encountered. Intelligent, responsible, remarkably mature for their ages. Their father has
done an extraordinary job under extremely difficult circumstances." Sarah found herself leaning forward with interest. Carter's opinion carried considerable weight, both because of her professional expertise and because her position as the town's physician gave her insights into family dynamics that were unavailable to most observers. "It must be challenging," Sarah ventured, "raising so many children without assistance." Dr. Carter's expression grew more serious. "More challenging than most people realize. Bear Thompson lost his wife during a particularly virulent fever outbreak that swept through the mountain communities 3 years ago. I was called to treat Maria Thompson, and I can tell you that despite everything I tried, every treatment available, she was beyond saving by the time I reached their homestead. The fever had progressed too far, too fast." The doctor paused, her professional composure slipping slightly as she recalled what had obviously been a frustrating and tragic experience. Bear was devastated, of course. They had been deeply devoted to each other, partners in every sense of the word. Maria wasn't just his wife, but his closest collaborator in building their life on that mountain. She had been the one who managed the household, educated the children, maintained the garden that provided much of their food supply, and served as the emotional center that held such a large family together. Sarah could imagine the enormity of such a loss, not just the grief of losing a beloved spouse but the practical catastrophe of suddenly being solely responsible for 12 children ranging from infants to teenagers. How did he manage? How does anyone cope with such an overwhelming responsibility? "By becoming something more than human, apparently," Dr. Carter replied with a mixture of admiration and concern. Bear threw himself into the task with the kind of single-minded determination that borders on obsession. He reorganized the entire household operation, assigned responsibilities to the older boys, established routines and systems that would allow the family to function without outside assistance. Most remarkably, he somehow managed to maintain the emotional stability that 12 grieving children desperately needed. The doctor moved to the window, gazing out at the mountain peaks that rose beyond the town's boundaries. "I've visited their homestead several times over the past 3 years, for various medical concerns and routine checkups. What I've seen there is nothing short of miraculous. Those boys function as a cohesive unit, supporting each other, contributing according to their abilities, displaying the kind of family loyalty and cooperation that most parents can only dream of achieving." "But surely," Sarah said, voicing the concern that had been growing in her mind, "there are aspects of child-rearing that require feminine influence. Not from any inherent inadequacy in men, but simply because growing children need diverse perspectives and guidance." Carter turned back from the window, her expression thoughtful. "That's exactly what worries me, and why I wanted to speak with you today. Bear Thompson is an exceptional man, and he's accomplished something extraordinary with those boys. But he's also human, and the strain of trying to be everything to 12 children is taking its toll." The doctor's words carried the weight of professional observation and personal concern. "During my most recent visit to the homestead, I noticed signs that troubled me. Bear has lost weight, shows evidence of chronic fatigue, and displays the kind of emotional remoteness that sometimes develops when people push themselves beyond sustainable limits. He's functioning adequately, but he's running on reserves that won't last indefinitely." Sarah felt a chill of recognition. She had seen similar patterns during her years of teaching, parents who drove themselves to exhaustion trying to meet impossible demands, often with tragic results for entire families. "More concerning, Dr. Carter continued, are the subtle changes I've observed in some of the children. The older boys have taken on responsibilities that would challenge adults, and while they're handling these duties admirably, they're also sacrificing aspects of their own development. The younger children are showing signs of the kind of premature maturity that sometimes develops when childhood ends too early." The picture Dr. Carter was painting was both impressive and deeply troubling. The Thompson family had achieved remarkable stability under impossible circumstances, but that stability might be more fragile than external appearances suggested. "What can be done?" Sarah asked. "If Bear Thompson is as independent as people say, he's unlikely to accept offers of assistance, particularly if they come with implications that he's failing as a father. Dr. Carter smiled for the first time since beginning this serious conversation. That's precisely why I wanted to speak with you. Most of the well-meaning people in this town approach the Thompson situation from a position of assumed superiority, as if their conventional family arrangements automatically qualify them to judge or assist a man who's accomplishing something they couldn't begin to attempt. The doctor paused, choosing her words carefully. You, however, have demonstrated both professional competence and personal independence. You understand what it means to make an unconventional life work, to succeed through determination and creativity rather than simply following established patterns. Bear Thompson might actually listen to someone who approaches him as an equal rather than a charity case. Sarah felt a sudden flutter of nervousness as she began to understand the direction this conversation was taking. Dr. Carter, what exactly are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that those 12 boys deserve access to formal education, and that their father deserves to have a partner in the enormous task he's undertaken. Not a replacement for their mother, which would be impossible, but someone who could share the load and bring complementary skills to their household. The suggestion was so unexpected, so far beyond anything Sarah had considered, that she found herself momentarily speechless. When she finally managed to respond, her voice was higher than usual. You're talking about marriage. I'm talking about a practical arrangement that could benefit everyone involved, Dr. Carter corrected gently. Bear Thompson needs assistance, whether he's willing to admit it or not. Those children need educational opportunities and feminine guidance, and you, if you'll forgive my directness, need a position that offers more security and fulfillment than teaching in a one-room schoolhouse for minimal wages. Sarah had been pacing around the classroom as they talked, but now she stopped abruptly, turning to face the doctor with an expression that mixed shock and curiosity. Carter, you're suggesting that I propose marriage to a man I've never met, to become stepmother to 12 children, based on a single conversation with 3 of his sons. I'm suggesting that you consider meeting him, Dr. Carter replied calmly. Bear Thompson comes to town periodically for supplies. The next time he does, you might find an opportunity to engage him in conversation. Judge for yourself whether he's the kind of man who could appreciate what you have to offer. The idea was so audacious that Sarah found herself simultaneously appalled and intrigued. Everything she had been taught about proper courtship, appropriate feminine behavior, and sensible life choices argued against even considering such a proposal. Yet something deeper, some instinct that had guided her through previous unconventional decisions, whispered that this might be an opportunity rather than madness. Even if I were willing to consider such an arrangement, Sarah said slowly, what makes you think Bear Thompson would be interested? From everything I've heard, he's been quite adamant about refusing assistance. Dr. Carter's smile returned, warmer this time, because I know Bear Thompson better than most people in this town realize. He's proud, certainly, and independent to a fault, but he's also intelligent enough to recognize genuine capability when he sees it, and practical enough to accept help that comes without strings or condescension attached. The doctor gathered her medical bag and prepared to leave, but paused at the classroom door. Sarah, I've watched you work with children, seen how you approach problems, observed how you carry yourself in a community that can be challenging for independent women. You have qualities that would be invaluable in the situation I'm describing. The question is whether you have the courage to pursue an opportunity that doesn't fit conventional expectations. After Dr. Carter departed, Sarah found herself unable to concentrate on her lesson planning or any of the other tasks that normally occupied her afternoon hours. The conversation had opened possibilities that she had never imagined, while simultaneously raising questions about her own motivations and desires that she wasn't sure she was prepared to answer. The truth was that her position in Cedar Falls, while adequate, offered limited prospects for advancement or personal fulfillment. Teaching positions for women typically lasted only until marriage, and in a small town with few eligible men, and even fewer who would appreciate an educated wife, the likelihood of finding a suitable husband was correspondingly small. She could continue as a spinster school teacher indefinitely, growing gradually more isolated and irrelevant as younger women replaced her and social opportunities diminished with each passing year. The alternative Dr. Carter had suggested was certainly unconventional, but it offered something that Sarah had begun to think might be permanently beyond her reach, a chance to be truly useful, to apply her skills and knowledge in circumstances where they could make a genuine difference. The prospect of educating 12 intelligent children, of helping to guide their development and prepare them for adult life, appealed to her professional instincts in ways that teaching routine lessons to the same small group of town children never could. More personally, the idea of joining a family that functioned as a genuine partnership,
where every member contributed according to their abilities and worked toward common goals, struck her as infinitely more attractive than the isolated gentility that seemed to be her most likely future. She had grown tired of being regarded as a curiosity, the educated woman who didn't quite fit into traditional social categories. The possibility of finding a place where her capabilities would be valued rather than merely tolerated was seductive in ways she was only beginning to understand. Yet the practical obstacles remained daunting. She knew virtually nothing about Bear Thompson beyond second-hand reports and brief observations of his children. The man might be everything Dr. Carter suggested, or he might be a difficult, domineering individual whose independence masked character flaws that would make him impossible to live with. The children, impressive as they had seemed during her limited contact, might resent any attempt by an outsider to join their tightly knit family unit. Most challenging of all, the entire arrangement would depend on Bear Thompson's willingness to consider marriage to a woman he had never met, proposed for purely practical reasons rather than romantic attachment. Sarah spent the remainder of the afternoon, and most of the evening turning these considerations over in her mind, examining the proposal from every angle she could imagine. By the time she finally retired for the night, she had reached a decision that surprised her with its clarity and determination. She would find a way to meet Bear Thompson, assess the situation for herself, and determine whether Dr. Carter's suggestion had any merit beyond theoretical appeal. The opportunity came sooner than expected, arriving on a crisp October morning, when the first serious frost had painted the mountain peaks silver, and the air carried the sharp scent of approaching winter. Sarah was preparing for the school day when Martha Green burst through the classroom door with the kind of excited energy that indicated significant news. "Sarah, you'll never guess who's in town," Martha announced without preamble. "Bear Thompson himself with 4 of his boys, loading up supplies like they're preparing for a siege. Apparently winter comes early up on Pine Ridge, and they need everything from flour to lamp oil to last until spring." Sarah felt her heart rate increase, but managed to keep her voice level. "How interesting. I don't believe I've had the opportunity to meet Mr. Thompson yet." Martha's eyes sparkled with the kind of mischief that suggested she knew more about Sarah's interest than she was admitting. "Well, now might be your chance. He's over at the general store, probably will be for another hour or so given the size of the order he's placing. Garrett says it's the biggest single purchase he's seen all year." Sarah made a show of checking the classroom clock and organizing her teaching materials, while internally debating whether this was the right moment to pursue Dr. Carter's suggestion. The logical part of her mind argued for more preparation, more thought, more careful consideration of exactly how to approach such a delicate situation. The more impulsive part whispered that opportunities like this might not come again for months, and that overthinking could be just another form of cowardice. "Perhaps I should introduce myself," Sarah said finally with what she hoped was appropriate casualness. "It seems only neighborly, given that his children live in the area." Martha's grin suggested that this response was exactly what she had been hoping for. "Excellent idea, very neighborly indeed. I'm sure Mr. Thompson would appreciate meeting the local school teacher." Sarah gathered her shawl and stepped out into the crisp morning air, walking toward the general store with measured steps that disguised the nervous excitement building in her chest. Through the store's large front windows, she could see several figures moving about inside, and as she approached the entrance, she heard a deep voice discussing delivery schedules and payment arrangements with what was obviously detailed knowledge of practical logistics. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, Sarah pushed open the store door and stepped inside. Part 3. The Unexpected Encounter. The interior of Garrett's general store was a testament to frontier pragmatism, every inch of space utilized for displaying the goods that kept mountain communities supplied with necessities and occasional luxuries. Shelves reached from floor to ceiling, packed with everything from bolts of cloth to farming implements, while barrels of flour, sugar and salt occupied strategic positions around the room. The air was rich with the mingled scents of leather, tobacco, coffee, and the indefinable mixture of aromas that accumulated in any establishment where people gathered to conduct the serious business of survival. Sarah paused just inside the doorway, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dimmer interior light while taking in the scene before her. Near the back of the store, where Garrett kept his more expensive items under closer supervision, a man was examining a display of winter coats with the kind of methodical attention that suggested he was making decisions that would affect his family's comfort for months to come. Even from a distance, there was no mistaking Bear Thompson. He was exactly as tall as the stories had suggested, perhaps 6 feet and 4 inches, with the kind of broad-shouldered, powerful build that came from years of physical labor in demanding conditions. His dark hair showed threads of silver at the temples, and his weathered face bore the deep tan that marked men who spent their lives outdoors. He moved with the deliberate economy of someone accustomed to accomplishing maximum results with minimum wasted effort, examining each garment with practiced hands that could assess quality and durability at a glance. Beside him stood 4 boys who were obviously his sons, ranging in age from perhaps 10 to 16. Sarah recognized 2 of them as Daniel and Caleb from her previous encounter by the creek, while the other 2 were strangers who nonetheless shared the same general appearance and demeanor that marked all the Thompson children she had met. They were participating in the coat selection process with serious attention, offering opinions and asking questions that suggested this was a collaborative family decision rather than a patriarchal decree. "The heavy wool will be warmer," the oldest boy was saying, fingering the material of a dark blue coat, "but it's also going to be heavier to work in. Might be better for Sunday wear than everyday use." Bear Thompson nodded approvingly at this analysis. "Good thinking, Daniel. We need gear that can handle whatever work we throw at it. Weight matters when you're splitting wood or hauling feed in a snowstorm." Sarah found herself impressed by the thoughtful way father and sons approached what others might consider a routine purchase. They were clearly operating with a limited budget, making choices that would have to satisfy multiple needs over an extended period. Yet there was no sense of stress or deprivation in their discussion, only the kind of careful planning that characterized people who understood the value of resources and used them wisely. "Excuse me," she said, approaching the group with what she hoped was appropriate confidence. "Are you Mr. Thompson? I'm Sarah Mitchell, the school teacher here in town. I believe I've had the pleasure of meeting some of your sons." Bear Thompson turned toward her with the kind of measured attention he had been giving the winter coats, and Sarah found herself looking into gray eyes that were both intelligent and guardedly polite. He was younger than she had expected, probably not yet 40, though the responsibilities he carried and the life he lived had given his face the kind of serious cast that could make a man seem older than his years. "Miss Mitchell," he said, touching his hat brim in acknowledgement. "Yes, Caleb mentioned meeting you down by the creek. Said you were interested in their fish trap project." The fact that her encounter with his sons had been discussed in the Thompson household was both flattering and slightly unnerving. Sarah wondered what else might have been said about her, and whether Bear Thompson had formed any preliminary opinions about the new school teacher based on his children's reports. It was a fascinating demonstration of practical engineering. Sarah replied honestly, "Your boys are clearly quite capable young men. You should be very proud of them." Something shifted subtly in Bear Thompson's expression, a barely perceptible relaxation that suggested this compliment had struck a responsive chord. "They're good boys," he agreed simply. "Work hard, think for themselves, look out for each other. A man couldn't ask for better sons." The straightforward pride in his voice was touching, entirely free of the boastful quality that sometimes characterized parents discussing their children's accomplishments. Bear Thompson was stating facts rather than seeking validation, and Sarah found this directness appealing. "I understand they receive their education at home," Sarah continued, venturing onto what might be sensitive territory. "That must require considerable time and effort on your part." Bear's eyes sharpened slightly, and Sarah sensed that this was indeed a potentially complicated subject. "We manage," he said carefully. "Boys learn what they need to know, when they need to know it. Real education comes from doing things, solving problems, taking responsibility for results." The response was polite, but carried an undertone that suggested previous conversations on this topic had not ended well. Sarah realized she needed to approach the subject with more subtlety, if she hoped to avoid triggering the kind of defensive reaction that had probably characterized most attempts to discuss the Thompson children's schooling. "That's certainly true," she agreed. "Practical experience is invaluable, though I sometimes find that children enjoy having opportunities to explore subjects beyond their immediate environment as well. Literature, history, mathematics beyond basic arithmetic. Not because such knowledge is more important than practical skills, but because it can open doors to different ways of thinking about problems." Bear Thompson studied her for a moment, as if trying to determine whether this was the beginning of another well-meaning attempt to convince him that his children were being deprived of essential opportunities. When he spoke, his tone was more curious than defensive. "What kind of doors?" The question suggested genuine interest rather than polite dismissal, and Sarah felt a flutter of excitement at the possibility that she might actually be able to engage this man in meaningful conversation about education. Well, for instance, understanding principles of mathematics and physics can lead to more sophisticated engineering solutions. Your son Caleb was working on hydraulic flow problems with his fish trap, but he might be able to achieve even better results if he understood the underlying scientific principles that govern water behavior. She paused, watching Bear's face for signs of reaction. Or consider history and literature, learning about how other people have faced challenges similar to yours, how they've solved problems or made decisions under pressure, can provide additional perspectives when you're dealing with difficult situations. Bear Thompson was silent for several moments, considering this response with the same careful attention he had given the winter coats. Around them, his sons had stopped their own conversation to listen, clearly interested in this exchange between their father and the school teacher. "You're talking about tools," Bear said finally. "Different kinds of tools than hammers and saws, but tools nonetheless. Ways of thinking that might be useful when practical experience isn't enough by itself." Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction at his understanding. "Exactly. I'm not suggesting that formal education should replace practical learning, only that it might complement it. Give your sons additional resources to draw upon when they face challenges that require new kinds of solutions." "And you think they're ready for such learning?" Bear asked, his tone carrying what might have been genuine curiosity. "Boys who've spent their lives on a mountain working with their hands, solving problems as they come up, Mr. Thompson," Sarah said, allowing her professional enthusiasm to show through her diplomatic restraint. "In my experience, children who grow up solving real problems are often the best students. They understand that learning has practical applications, that knowledge can be immediately useful rather than merely abstract. Your sons have demonstrated analytical thinking, collaborative problem solving, and intellectual curiosity. Those are exactly the qualities that make formal education most effective." The extended conversation had drawn the attention of other customers in the store, and Sarah became aware that their exchange was being observed with considerable interest by several townspeople who had probably never seen anyone engage Bear Thompson in such detailed discussion. She also noticed that Garrett himself was hovering nearby, ostensibly arranging merchandise but obviously listening to every word. Bear Thompson seemed oblivious to this audience, his attention focused entirely on Sarah and the ideas she was presenting. "Miss Mitchell," he said slowly, "you're suggesting something that most folks around here have been hinting at for years, but you're approaching it differently. Not telling me what I ought to do, but explaining why I might want to consider it." "Because the decision has to be yours," Sarah replied, "and it has to make sense for your family's circumstances. I wouldn't presume to tell you how to raise your children, Mr. Thompson, but I would be honored to discuss possibilities if you think such a conversation might be worthwhile." The silence that followed was broken by Caleb, who had been listening to the entire exchange with growing excitement. "Pa, remember what you always tell us about considering all available information before making important decisions." Bear Thompson looked down at his son with an expression that mixed amusement and exasperation. "Yes, Caleb, I remember." "Well," the boy continued with the kind of logical persistence that suggested he had inherited his father's analytical mind, "wouldn't it make sense to find out more about what Miss Mitchell is offering before deciding whether it might be useful?" Sarah had to suppress a smile at the boy's diplomatic manipulation of his father's own principles. Clearly the Thompson children had been thinking about educational opportunities more than their father realized, and at least some of them were prepared to advocate for changes in their current arrangements. Bear Thompson sighed, a sound that suggested he recognized he was being maneuvered but wasn't entirely displeased by his son's initiative. "Miss Mitchell, would you be willing to discuss this matter further, perhaps at a time and place where we wouldn't be quite so conspicuous?" Sarah glanced around the store, suddenly aware that their conversation had indeed become a form of public entertainment for the other customers. "Of course. Would you prefer to continue this discussion privately?" "If you wouldn't mind," Bear replied. "We'll be in town for another hour or so, finishing our supply purchases. Would it be convenient for you to meet us at the church? It should be empty at this time of day, and Pastor Hayes won't mind if we borrow the space for a few minutes." The suggestion was both practical and slightly surprising, indicating that Bear Thompson was willing to discuss educational matters in what was a public building, where their conversation might be observed but not easily overheard. It also suggested a level of respect for Sarah's professional status that she hadn't been certain he possessed. That would be perfect, Sarah agreed. Shall we say in about an hour? Bear nodded, then turned back to his sons and their interrupted shopping. Daniel, help me figure out which of these coats will work best for Samuel and Joshua. We need to get this order finished so we can keep our appointment with Miss Mitchell. As Sarah left the general store, she was acutely aware of the speculative glances that followed her departure. By evening she realized, the entire town would know that the new school teacher had engaged Bear Thompson in extended conversation and arranged a private meeting with him. The implications of such behavior would provide material for gossip and speculation for weeks to come. More importantly, she had committed herself to a course of action that could fundamentally alter her life in Cedar Falls. Whether that change would prove positive or catastrophic remained to be determined, but there was no longer any possibility of retreat. Part 4. Crossing the Threshold. The Cedar Falls Community Church occupied a prominent position at the intersection of Main Street and Church Road, its white clapboard exterior and modest steeple serving as both architectural focal point and moral anchor for the growing settlement. Built 5 years earlier through the combined efforts of multiple denominations who had agreed to share the space.
Rather than construct separate buildings, it represented the kind of practical cooperation that characterized successful frontier communities. The interior was simple but well maintained, with wooden pews arranged in neat rows facing a raised platform that served as pulpit, and tall windows that provided excellent natural light during daytime services. Sarah arrived at the church precisely on time, carrying a leather satchel that contained several textbooks, examples of student work, and other materials she thought might be useful in explaining her educational philosophy to Bear Thompson. She had spent the intervening hour in careful preparation, organizing her thoughts and assembling evidence that might demonstrate the value of formal learning without appearing to criticize the Thompson family's current arrangements. The church was indeed empty, as Bear had predicted, filled with the kind of peaceful quiet that accumulates in buildings designed for contemplation. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air and casting geometric patterns across the polished wooden floor. Sarah chose a pew near the middle of the sanctuary, and arranged her materials, then sat back to wait and consider exactly how she wanted to approach the upcoming conversation. She didn't have long to wait. Within minutes, she heard the sound of approaching voices, and Bear Thompson entered the church, followed by his 4 sons. In the more formal setting, away from the commercial bustle of the general store, the Thompson family seemed both more imposing and more approachable. Bear himself moved with the kind of quiet confidence that suggested he was comfortable in any environment, while his boys displayed the respectful demeanor appropriate to a religious setting without appearing intimidated or out of place. "Miss Mitchell," Bear said, removing his hat as he approached her pew, "thank you for taking the time to discuss this matter with us. I hope you don't mind that I brought the boys along. This concerns them directly, and I believe they should have a voice in any decisions that might affect their future." The inclusion of the children in what was essentially an adult negotiation struck Sarah as both unusual and admirable. Most parents made educational decisions with minimal input from their offspring, treating schooling as something imposed upon children rather than chosen by them. Bear Thompson's willingness to involve his sons suggested both respect for their intelligence and confidence in his own ability to guide their decision-making process. "Of course," Sarah replied, "I think it's wonderful that you want them to participate. After all, they're the ones who would be most directly affected by any changes in their educational arrangements." Bear and his sons settled into the pew across the aisle from Sarah, creating an informal conference atmosphere that felt more like a family meeting than a formal interview. The boys arranged themselves according to age, with Daniel and Caleb flanking their father while the 2 younger ones, whom Sarah now realized must be Isaac and Nathan, positioned themselves where they could observe the proceedings without being expected to participate, unless they chose to do so. "Miss Mitchell," Bear began, "I'll be direct with you because I believe honesty serves everyone better than polite evasion. Over the past 3 years I've had numerous people suggest that my boys need formal schooling, and I've declined all such offers for reasons that seemed sufficient at the time. Before we discuss your particular proposal, I'd like to understand what makes your approach different from the others." The question was both fair and challenging, requiring Sarah to articulate her educational philosophy in terms that would be meaningful to someone who had obviously given considerable thought to alternative forms of learning. She took a moment to organize her response, then leaned forward slightly to emphasize her sincerity. Mr. Thompson, most educational discussions I've observed begin with the assumption that children who aren't attending formal school are automatically being deprived of essential opportunities. That assumption leads to conversations that are really about correcting deficiencies rather than building upon existing strengths. She paused, noting that Bear was listening with the kind of focused attention that suggested her words were being carefully evaluated. My approach begins with the recognition that your sons are already receiving an excellent education, just not a conventional one. They're learning problem-solving, responsibility, collaboration, practical skills and independent thinking. These are precisely the qualities that make formal learning most effective when it's added to such a foundation. You're saying we wouldn't be starting from scratch, Daniel interjected, speaking directly to Sarah for the first time, that what we already know would be valuable rather than something to be replaced. Exactly, Sarah confirmed, pleased by his quick understanding. Formal education should expand your existing capabilities, not substitute for them. The goal would be to give you additional tools for analyzing problems, accessing information, and communicating ideas, not to change who you are or how you think. Bear nodded slowly, his expression suggesting this perspective was indeed different from what he had encountered previously. And how would such an arrangement work practically? My boys have responsibilities at home that can't be ignored for the sake of classroom schedules. This was the crucial question, the point where most educational proposals probably foundered on the realities of Thompson family life. Sarah had anticipated this concern and spent considerable time thinking about possible solutions. That would depend on what worked best for your family, she replied. Traditional schooling assumes that education happens in a specific place at specific times, but learning is actually much more flexible than that. We could arrange instruction around your seasonal schedule, focusing on intensive periods when farm work is lighter and shorter sessions when your time is more limited. She reached into her satchel and withdrew several books, placing them on the pew between herself and the Thompson family. We could also use a combination of group instruction and individual study, where the older boys help teach the younger ones while working on more advanced material themselves. That would actually enhance their own learning while distributing the teaching load. Caleb leaned forward to examine the books, his eyes lighting up with obvious interest. Are these the kinds of things we'd be studying? These are examples, Sarah explained. Mathematics that builds on the arithmetic you already use for practical calculations, but extends into areas like geometry and algebra, that could help with engineering and construction projects. Science that explains the principles behind things you observe every day, but gives you tools for predicting and controlling natural processes. Literature and history that introduce you to different ways people have thought about problems similar to the ones you face. Could we still learn practical things too? Nathan asked, speaking up for the first time. I mean, would we have to choose between book learning and real work? Sarah smiled at the question, recognizing the underlying concern. Nathan, the most effective education combines both kinds of learning. We could work on mathematics while planning construction projects, study physics while improving mechanical devices, learn about different cultures while discussing how families in other places solve problems similar to yours. Bear had been examining the textbooks while listening to this exchange, his calloused hands turning pages with surprising gentleness. When he looked up, his expression was thoughtful rather than skeptical. Miss Mitchell, this sounds promising in theory, but it would require considerable time and effort from someone qualified to provide such instruction. I assume you're thinking about taking on this responsibility yourself, rather than simply recommending that I send the boys to the regular school in town. The directness of the question forced Sarah to confront the full implications of what she was proposing. Up until this moment, their conversation had focused on educational philosophy and general possibilities. Now they were moving into the realm of specific arrangements that would affect everyone's daily life in fundamental ways. Yes, she said simply. I believe this kind of individualized instruction would be far more effective than trying to fit your sons into a conventional classroom setting. They're too advanced in some areas and too specialized in others for standard grade-level assignments to be useful. And you would be willing to relocate to our homestead to provide such instruction? Bear continued, his tone remaining carefully neutral. Because I can tell you right now that bringing 12 boys down to town on a regular basis for school would be completely impractical. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as the conversation moved toward the crucial point that Dr. Carter had raised. Mr. Thompson, I would need to understand exactly what kind of arrangement you might be willing to consider. Obviously, there are practical and social considerations that would have to be addressed. The silence that followed stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable before Bear Thompson spoke again, his words carrying the weight of a decision that had clearly been building throughout their conversation. Miss Mitchell, I'm going to be more direct than social convention typically allows, because I believe you deserve honesty, and because my son's welfare is more important to me than maintaining polite pretenses. He shifted slightly in his pew, his gray eyes meeting hers with steady intensity. What you're describing would require you to become part of our household on a permanent basis. Given the isolation of our homestead and the nature of the arrangement, there would be only one socially acceptable way for such a situation to exist. Sarah felt the blood rush to her cheeks as Bear articulated what she had been thinking, but hadn't quite had the courage to voice. The practical implications of providing education to the Thompson children would indeed require her to live at their mountain homestead, and frontier social conventions would never tolerate an unmarried woman residing with a widowed man and his 12 sons, regardless of how innocent or beneficial the arrangement might be. You're talking about marriage, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. I am, Bear confirmed without hesitation, but not the kind of marriage that most people would expect or that you might have dreamed of as a young woman. I'm talking about a partnership based on mutual benefit and respect, where you would gain security and purpose while my boys would gain access to the education they deserve. The oldest Thompson son, Daniel, looked between his father and Sarah with an expression that suggested this conversation was moving in directions he hadn't anticipated.
Pa, are you asking Miss Mitchell to marry you?
Bear turned to his son with the same straightforward honesty that had characterized his discussion with Sarah. I'm explaining to Miss Mitchell what would be required to make her educational proposal practical, Daniel. Whether she would be willing to enter into such an arrangement is her decision to make. Sarah found herself studying the faces of the 4 boys present, trying to gauge their reactions to this extraordinary development. Rather than the shock or resistance she might have expected, she saw curiosity, thoughtfulness, and what appeared to be cautious hope. These children had been without a mother for 3 years, and while they had clearly adapted to their circumstances with remarkable resilience, the possibility of feminine guidance and companionship was obviously appealing. Mr. Thompson, Sarah said carefully, such an arrangement would represent an enormous change for all of us. Your sons would be gaining not just a teacher but a stepmother, while I would be taking on responsibilities that extend far beyond education. Are you confident that everyone involved would be comfortable with such a dramatic alteration in your family dynamics? It was Caleb who answered, his young voice carrying a maturity that reminded Sarah of his father's directness. Miss Mitchell, we've been managing fine on our own, but that doesn't mean we wouldn't welcome having a woman as part of our family again. Someone who could teach us things Pa can't, help us understand parts of the world we've never experienced, maybe even help Pa with some of the load he's been carrying all by himself. The insight and emotional intelligence displayed by this 12-year-old struck Sarah as remarkable evidence of the kind of children Bear Thompson had raised. Rather than seeing her as a potential intruder or replacement for their mother, they were viewing her as a possible addition to their family team, someone who could contribute new capabilities while respecting existing relationships. And what about you, Mr. Thompson? Sarah asked, returning her attention to the man whose proposal was reshaping everything she had thought she knew about her future. What would you expect from such a marriage beyond the educational benefits for your sons? Bear considered the question with the same careful thought he had given to every aspect of their conversation. I would expect partnership, Miss Mitchell. Someone who could share the responsibilities of running a large household, contribute skills and perspectives that I lack, and help me ensure that my sons grow into the kind of men their mother would have been proud of. He paused, his expression growing more serious. I won't pretend that I'm offering you romance or passionate love, because that wouldn't be honest. What I can offer is respect, security, meaningful work, and the satisfaction of knowing that your efforts are making a real difference in the lives of children who need what you have to give. The straightforward acknowledgement that this would be a practical rather than romantic union was somehow more appealing to Sarah than flowery declarations might have been. She had spent enough time observing marriages based primarily on initial attraction to understand that lasting partnerships required deeper foundations than mere sentiment. The possibility of joining a family where her contributions would be genuinely valued, where her skills would be fully utilized, and where she could help shape the development of 12 remarkable children, was more compelling than any conventional courtship she could imagine.
I would need to understand more about what daily life would be like, Sarah said, her tone indicating serious consideration, rather than polite deflection. The practical arrangements, the division of responsibilities, the expectations for how this household would function. Of course, Bear agreed immediately, and the best way to understand those things would be to visit our homestead, see how we live, meet the rest of my sons, and judge for yourself whether this is something you could commit to permanently. The suggestion was both logical and slightly overwhelming. Sarah realized that she was being invited to step completely outside the conventional boundaries of her current life, to consider possibilities that would have seemed impossible when she woke up that morning. When would such a visit be possible? She heard herself asking, as if the words were being spoken by someone else. We'll be heading back up the mountain this afternoon, Bear replied. You could come with us now, spend a few days getting acquainted with our situation, and then decide whether you want to pursue this arrangement further. The boys could ride double on some of the horses, and we have supplies enough to accommodate an additional person for several days. The immediacy of the offer was both exciting and terrifying. Sarah had imagined that any further developments would involve careful planning, extended correspondence, perhaps weeks of gradual preparation. Instead, she was being invited to make a decision that could alter the course of her entire life within the space of a single afternoon. I would need to make arrangements for my classes, she said, her practical mind engaging even as her emotions churned with excitement and apprehension. Find someone to cover my teaching responsibilities for a few days. Dr. Carter could probably arrange that, Daniel suggested. She knows most of the families in town, and she's helped with the school before when Miss Pritchard was sick. The mention Carter reminded Sarah that this entire situation had originated with the doctor's suggestion, and that she would likely be supportive of any arrangement that benefited the Thompson family. It also occurred to her that Dr. Carter's endorsement would carry considerable weight with the school board and the townspeople who might question her temporary absence from her duties. Thompson, Sarah said, feeling as though she was standing at the edge of a precipice, if I were to visit your homestead and decide that this arrangement could work, how quickly would you want to proceed with the marriage? As quickly as practical considerations would allow, Bear replied without hesitation. Winter sets in early at our elevation, and once the heavy snows start, we're essentially cut off from town until spring. If we're going to do this, it would need to happen within the next few weeks. The timeline was daunting, but Sarah recognized the practical logic behind it. Mountain weather was notoriously unpredictable, and the isolation Bear described would make any extended courtship or gradual transition impossible. If she was going to join the Thompson family, it would need to be a decisive commitment rather than a tentative experiment. I'll need an hour to speak with Dr. Carter and make arrangements for my classes, Sarah said, surprised by her own decisiveness. If she can cover my responsibilities, I would be willing to accompany you to your homestead this afternoon. The four Thompson boys exchanged glances that clearly conveyed excitement and anticipation, while Bear nodded with the kind of satisfied approval that suggested he had been hoping for exactly this response. Excellent, he said, rising from the pew. We'll finish loading our supplies and meet you at the general store in an hour. Bring whatever you'll need for several days, including warm clothes. It gets considerably colder up on the mountain than it does here in town. As the Thompson family filed out of the church, Sarah remained seated for several minutes, trying to absorb the magnitude of what she had just agreed to do. In the space of a single conversation, she had moved from being a small-town schoolteacher with limited prospects to a woman considering marriage to a man she had met that morning, motherhood to 12 children she barely knew, and life in a mountain wilderness she had never seen. The rational part of her mind insisted that such hasty decisions were the height of foolishness, that sensible people didn't reorganize their entire lives based on a single conversation with strangers. Yet something deeper and more intuitive whispered that this opportunity represented exactly the kind of meaningful challenge she had been unconsciously seeking, a chance to apply her abilities in circumstances where they could make a genuine difference. More than that, she found herself genuinely attracted to Bear Thompson's straightforward honesty, his obvious devotion to his children, and his willingness to consider unconventional solutions to complex problems. The Thompson family's success in creating a functional, loving household under extraordinary circumstances suggested depths of character and capability that would make them remarkable partners in any endeavor. Sarah gathered her materials and left the church, walking quickly toward Dr. Carter's office with a sense of purpose that surprised her with its clarity. Whatever uncertainties lay ahead, she was committed to exploring this extraordinary possibility to its conclusion. Carter's medical practice occupied the ground floor of a substantial two-story building on Main Street, with living quarters upstairs and a well-equipped examination room, office and small surgery that served the medical needs of Cedar Falls and the surrounding area. Sarah found the doctor between patients, reviewing medical journals that had arrived on the most recent stage from Denver, and she looked up with obvious pleasure when Sarah entered. "Sarah, what brings you here this afternoon? You look rather flushed. I hope you're not coming down with something." "Dr. Carter, I need to ask you an enormous favor," Sarah said without preamble, "and I need to tell you that your suggestion about the Thompson family has led to developments I never could have anticipated." The doctor's eyebrows rose with interest, and she set aside her journals to give Sarah her complete attention. "This sounds fascinating. Please sit down and tell me what's happened." Sarah quickly recounted her conversation with Bear Thompson, the educational proposal that had evolved into a discussion of marriage, and the invitation to visit the Thompson homestead that afternoon. Carter listened with growing amazement and obvious delight, occasionally interjecting questions but generally allowing Sarah to tell her story without interruption. "My goodness," Dr. Carter said when Sarah had finished. "I suggested that you might find an opportunity to meet Bear Thompson, but I never imagined things would develop so rapidly. Are you seriously considering his proposal?" "I think I am," Sarah admitted. "It's the most unconventional situation imaginable, but it's also the most appealing opportunity I've ever encountered. The chance to educate 12 intelligent children, to help manage a successful homestead operation, to be part of a family that functions as a genuine partnership, rather than a conventional hierarchy. It's everything I've wanted without knowing I wanted it." Dr. Carter smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose matchmaking instincts had proven remarkably accurate. "And Bear Thompson himself, what's your impression of him as a potential husband?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "He's nothing like the rough mountain hermit that town gossip suggested. He's intelligent, thoughtful, completely devoted to his children, and refreshingly honest about what he can and cannot offer. I find myself trusting his judgment, and respecting his character in ways that would have taken months to develop with most men." "That's an excellent foundation for marriage," Dr. Carter observed, "particularly the kind of practical partnership he's proposing. Romance and passion are wonderful, but they're not sufficient basis for the kind of long-term collaboration that successful marriages require." The doctor paused, studying Sarah's face with professional assessment. "What favor did you need to ask?" "I need someone to cover my classes for several days while I visit the Thompson homestead," Sarah explained. "The school board would probably accept your recommendation for a temporary substitute, and you know the families and children well enough to provide adequate instruction." Carter was already nodding before Sarah finished speaking. "Of course I'll help. In fact, I'd be delighted to see this arrangement work out. The Thompson family needs exactly what you can provide, and you need exactly the kind of challenge and purpose they can offer. Are you certain it won't be an imposition? I know how busy your medical practice keeps you." "Sarah, I've been hoping for years that Bear Thompson would find someone suitable to help him with those boys. If covering a few school sessions helps bring about such an outcome, it's hardly an imposition. It's an investment in the welfare of 12 children who deserve every advantage we can provide." Dr. Carter rose from her desk, and moved to a cabinet where she kept various medical supplies. "In fact, let me prepare a few things for you to take along. Basic medications, bandages, items that might be useful for a household so far from town. Consider it a contribution to your courtship." The practical gesture touched Sarah deeply, evidence of the kind of support and encouragement she would need if she was going to embark on such an unconventional path. "Dr. Carter, thank you for everything. For suggesting this possibility, for covering my classes, for believing that I might be capable of such an undertaking." "My dear," Dr. Carter replied warmly, "I've watched you work with children, seen how you approach challenges, observed how you carry yourself in difficult situations. If anyone can succeed in the arrangement Bear Thompson is proposing, it's you. Trust your instincts, and don't let conventional thinking prevent you from pursuing something that could bring genuine fulfillment." Sarah left Dr. Carter's office with a small bag of medical supplies, and a heart full of gratitude for the unexpected support she had received. Her next stop was the boarding house, where she quickly packed a travel bag with appropriate clothing and personal items, trying to anticipate what she might need for several days in a mountain environment, unlike anything she had previously experienced. Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house proprietor, observed these preparations with obvious curiosity and growing alarm. "Miss Mitchell, I hope you're not planning anything imprudent. Young women traveling alone into the wilderness with men they barely know, well, such behavior rarely ends favorably." "Mrs. Henderson, I appreciate your concern," Sarah replied diplomatically, "but I'm traveling as a professional educator to evaluate possible teaching opportunities. Dr. Carter is aware of my plans and has arranged to cover my school responsibilities." The mention of Dr. Carter's involvement seemed to reassure Mrs. Henderson somewhat, though her expression remained skeptical. "Well, I suppose if Dr. Carter approves, it must be respectable. Still, I do hope you'll be careful, my dear. Mountain folk can be quite different from town people." Sarah completed her packing and made her way back to the general store, where she found the Thompson family loading the final items into a large wagon that was clearly designed for transporting both supplies and people across difficult terrain. The vehicle was sturdy and well maintained, pulled by 4 strong horses that appeared capable of handling mountain roads with confidence. Bear Thompson looked up as she approached, his expression showing satisfaction that she had indeed decided to accompany them. "Miss Mitchell, I'm pleased you were able to make arrangements. Did you encounter any difficulties with the school board?" "Dr. Carter will be covering my classes," Sarah replied. She was very supportive of this opportunity. "Dr. Carter is a wise woman," Bear observed, helping Sarah place her bag in the wagon. "She's been a good friend to our family over the years, and her judgment carries considerable weight in this community." The 4 boys who had accompanied Bear to town were already seated in the wagon, having arranged the supplies to create comfortable seating areas that would accommodate the additional passenger. Sarah was impressed by their efficiency and thoughtfulness, the way they had automatically reorganized their space to include her without being asked or directed. "Miss Mitchell," Daniel said as she climbed into the wagon, "we're
excited to show you our home. It's quite different from town living, but we think you'll find it interesting." "I'm sure I will," Sarah replied, settling herself among the supplies with assistance from Caleb and Isaac. "I'm looking forward to meeting the rest of your brothers and seeing how you've organized your household." Bear took his place on the driver's seat, gathered the reins and guided the horses away from the general store toward the mountain road that would take them to the Thompson homestead. As they passed through town, Sarah was acutely aware of the curious stares that followed their progress, and she realized that by evening, everyone in Cedar Falls would know that the school teacher had left town with Bear Thompson and his sons. The implications of such visible behavior for her reputation and future options were significant, but Sarah found that she cared less about community gossip than she might have expected. The possibility that lay ahead was worth the risk of social disapproval, and she was beginning to understand that conventional respectability had always felt constraining rather than protective. The wagon road that led up Pine Ridge Mountain was rougher than any Sarah had previously traveled, winding through dense forest and across rocky terrain that required careful navigation and steady horses. As they climbed higher, the air grew noticeably cooler and thinner, while the views that opened up during occasional clearings became increasingly spectacular. She could see the town of Cedar Falls spread out below them, looking small and temporary against the vast wilderness that surrounded it. "How far is your homestead?" Sarah asked, partly from curiosity and partly to distract herself from the growing realization that she was traveling farther from civilization than she had ever been before. "About 8 miles from town," Bear replied, "but the mountain roads make it seem longer. We should reach home by late afternoon if the weather holds." The casual mention of weather concerns reminded Sarah that mountain conditions could change rapidly, and that the Thompson family's isolation was not merely a matter of distance but of genuine dependence on natural forces beyond human control. She was beginning to understand why Bear had emphasized the need for quick decisions about any potential marriage arrangements. Winter in this environment would be unlike anything she had experienced in her previous life. As they continued their ascent, the boys began pointing out landmarks and features of their mountain home, clearly eager to share their environment with someone who might become part of their family. Isaac showed her the creek that provided their water supply, while Nathan identified the meadows where they pastured their livestock during the warmer months. Caleb pointed out the stands of timber that provided both building materials and fuel for heating, and Daniel described the various trails that connected their property to neighboring homesteads and hunting areas. The enthusiasm and pride in their voices as they described their home was infectious, and Sarah found herself genuinely excited to see the place these remarkable children had helped to build and maintain. More than that, she was beginning to understand the appeal of a life connected so directly to the natural world, where success depended on practical skills, careful planning, and the ability to work cooperatively toward common goals. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when they finally crested a ridge, and Sarah got her first glimpse of the Thompson homestead spread out in the valley below. The sight took her breath away, not just because of the natural beauty of the setting, but because of the obvious evidence of human achievement and careful stewardship that characterized every aspect of the operation. The main house was larger than she had expected, a two-story log structure with a wide front porch and multiple chimneys that suggested both comfortable living quarters and efficient heating arrangements. Behind the house, a large barn and several outbuildings formed a practical complex designed to support a substantial agricultural operation, while fenced fields and pastures extended across the valley floor in patterns that spoke of careful land management and long-term planning. "Welcome to Timber Creek Ranch," Bear said simply, his voice carrying quiet pride in what his family had accomplished. "This is our home." Part 4, Crossing into New Territory. The wagon descended into the valley with careful precision, following a well-maintained road that spoke of years of gradual improvement and constant attention. As they approached the main house, Sarah could see that what had looked impressive from a distance was even more remarkable up close. The log construction was expertly crafted, with tight joints and careful chinking that would provide excellent insulation during harsh mountain winters. The front porch stretched across the entire width of the building, furnished with handmade chairs and benches that suggested this was a space designed for family gathering and relaxation. Most impressive of all were the signs of ongoing activity and meticulous care that characterized every aspect of the homestead. Firewood was neatly stacked in covered areas that would keep it dry through any weather. Gardens near the house showed evidence of recent harvest, with root vegetables still growing and storage areas prepared for winter preservation. Livestock in the visible pastures appeared healthy and well tended, while the various outbuildings showed the kind of systematic organization that maximized efficiency and minimized wasted effort. As the wagon rolled to a stop near the front porch, Sarah became aware of faces appearing at windows and doorways, obviously curious about the unexpected visitor their father had brought home. The boys who had accompanied Bear to town immediately began calling out to their brothers, announcing the arrival of Miss Mitchell, the schoolteacher, and within moments, Sarah found herself surrounded by more children than she had ever seen in one place outside of a classroom. The remaining 8 Thompson sons ranged in age from what appeared to be about 15 down to a toddler who could barely walk, and they displayed the same general characteristics that had impressed her in their older brothers: healthy appearance, well-behaved curiosity, and the kind of self-possessed confidence that came from growing up in an environment where every family member had important responsibilities and genuine value. Bear Thompson climbed down from the driver's seat and immediately began organizing the unloading process, issuing brief instructions that were followed with the kind of efficient cooperation that spoke of long-established routines. Yet Sarah noticed that even in the midst of these practical tasks, he took time to introduce her to each of the boys she hadn't previously met, providing names and brief descriptions that helped her begin to distinguish among the large group. "Miss Mitchell," he said, lifting the smallest child into his arms, "this is Michael, our youngest. He's 3 years old and has very definite opinions about everything, as you'll discover." The toddler studied Sarah with solemn dark eyes before offering a shy smile that was utterly charming. She found herself wondering what it would be like to help guide this little one's development, to be part of his daily life as he grew from curious child into capable young man. The older boys completed the introductions themselves, each stepping forward to shake Sarah's hand with the kind of formal courtesy that indicated careful training and proper manners. Samuel, who appeared to be about 14, had his father's gray eyes and serious demeanor. Joshua, perhaps 13, showed more of his mother's coloring with darker hair and skin that tanned easily. Benjamin, who looked to be about 9, had an infectious grin that suggested a mischievous sense of humor, while Luke, maybe 7, hung back shyly but watched everything with obvious intelligence. "Boys," Bear said once the introductions were complete, "Miss Mitchell will be staying with us for several days while we discuss educational arrangements. Timothy, Luke, and Benjamin, please help her get settled in the guest room. Samuel and Joshua, start unloading the supplies. Matthew, check on the livestock and make sure everything is secure for the night." The immediate assignment of tasks and responsibilities impressed Sarah with its efficiency, but also with the way each boy seemed to know exactly what was expected of him without requiring detailed instructions. This was obviously a household that functioned through well-established systems rather than constant supervision, allowing even the youngest children to contribute meaningfully to the family's daily operations. She followed Timothy, Luke, and Benjamin into the house, carrying her travel bag and looking around with amazement at the interior arrangements. The main floor was organized around a large central room that served multiple functions, with a massive stone fireplace providing both heat and cooking facilities, comfortable seating areas arranged for conversation and relaxation, and a long wooden table that could accommodate the entire family for meals and other activities. "This is where we eat and do lessons and play games," Timothy explained, clearly proud of their family space. Pei built all the furniture himself, except for the chairs that came from town. The craftsmanship was evident in every piece, from the sturdy table with its smooth, well-worn surface to the shelves and cabinets that provided storage while maintaining the room's spacious feel. Sarah noted several oil lamps positioned to provide good reading light, along with a collection of books that suggested the Thompson family was already more literate than many frontier households. Luke led her toward a staircase that curved up to the second floor, chattering eagerly about the various features of their home. "There are 6 bedrooms upstairs," he said. "Pei has 1, and we share the others depending on how much space everybody needs. The guest room is real nice, and it has a good view of the mountains." The guest room proved to be both comfortable and thoughtfully appointed, with a well-made bed, a washstand with fresh water, and a window that did indeed provide spectacular views of the surrounding peaks. Sarah set down her bag and looked around with appreciation for the care that had obviously gone into preparing the space for visitors. "Do you get many guests?" she asked Benjamin, who was adjusting the curtains to provide privacy while maintaining the mountain views. "Not too many," he admitted. "Dr. Carter comes up sometimes when somebody's sick, and occasionally we have neighbors stop by when they're traveling through. But mostly it's just family." The admission reminded Sarah of how isolated the Thompson household really was, and how unusual her presence must be for children who had limited contact with adults outside their immediate family. Yet rather than seeming awkward or uncertain about how to interact with a stranger, the boys appeared genuinely pleased to have a visitor, and eager to share their home with someone who might become a permanent addition. "Miss Mitchell," Timothy said, "Pei said we should let you rest and get settled, but if you want to see more of the place, we could show you around before supper." The offer was clearly motivated by enthusiasm rather than mere politeness, and Sarah found herself genuinely curious to explore the homestead that these remarkable children had helped to create. "I'd love to see more," she said, "though I should probably check with your father first to make sure I'm not interfering with evening routines." They found Bear in the barn working with Samuel and Joshua to unload the supplies they had purchased in town and organize them according to some system that ensured easy access when needed. The barn itself was as impressive as the house, a large structure that provided shelter for livestock, storage for feed and equipment, and workshop space for the various crafts and repairs that kept a homestead operation functioning. "Miss Mitchell," Bear said, looking up from the sack of flour he was positioning on a storage shelf, "I hope the boys have made you comfortable. Are you finding everything you need?" "Everything is wonderful," Sarah replied honestly. "I was hoping I might have a chance to see more of your operation before dark, if that wouldn't be inconvenient." Bear's expression showed obvious pleasure at her interest. "Of course. Boys, finish organizing these supplies, then join us for a tour of the property. Miss Mitchell should understand exactly how we live here before she makes any decisions about joining our family." The comprehensive tour that followed gave Sarah unprecedented insight into the complexity and sophistication of the Thompson homestead operation. What had appeared from a distance to be a simple mountain farm, proved to be a carefully integrated system designed to maximize self-sufficiency while providing security against the uncertainties of frontier life. The fields and pastures were arranged to take advantage of natural drainage and sun exposure, with crops selected not just for their nutritional value but for their ability to thrive in mountain conditions and store well through long winters. The livestock included cattle for meat and dairy, horses for transportation and fieldwork, pigs for efficient conversion of food scraps into protein, and chickens that provided both eggs and meat while requiring minimal maintenance. Most impressive were the various systems Bear had developed to ensure reliable access to essential resources regardless of weather conditions or seasonal limitations. Multiple wells provided water security,
while a sophisticated arrangement of root cellars, smokehouses and storage buildings could preserve enough food to sustain the family through extended periods of isolation. Workshop areas contained the tools and materials needed for most repairs and improvements, reducing dependence on outside suppliers while providing opportunities for the boys to develop practical skills. The goal, Bear explained as they walked through these various facilities, is to be prepared for whatever nature might throw at us, while still maintaining the kind of life that allows children to grow up healthy and happy. Sarah found herself genuinely impressed by the scope of Bear's planning and the sophistication of the solutions he had developed. This was clearly the work of a man who combined practical intelligence with long-term thinking, someone who understood that frontier success required both immediate competence and careful preparation for future challenges. "How do you manage to maintain all of this with just your family's labor?" she asked, noting the enormous amount of work that must be required to keep such an operation functioning efficiently. "By making sure everyone contributes according to their abilities," Bear replied, "and by organizing tasks so that we're always working smarter rather than just harder." He gestured toward his sons, who were scattered throughout the tour group, each ready to explain the aspects of the operation for which they had particular responsibility. "Every boy has specific duties that match his age and capabilities, but everyone also understands how their work connects to the overall success of our family. That makes even routine chores feel meaningful rather than just necessary." As if to illustrate this point, young Michael broke away from the group to examine a chicken coop, pointing excitedly at several hens and babbling in the mixture of words and gestures that characterized his current stage of language development. Daniel immediately moved to supervise his youngest brother, explaining in patient detail why the chickens needed to be left alone until morning feeding time. "Even Michael has jobs he can do," Bear said with obvious affection. "Gathering eggs that are within his reach, helping to scatter feed for the chickens, carrying small tools to whoever needs them. Nothing dangerous or beyond his abilities, but meaningful contributions that help him feel like an important part of our family team." The tour concluded at a large garden area behind the main house, where Sarah could see evidence of the kind of food production that would be essential for feeding such a large family. Root vegetables were still growing despite the lateness of the season, while other areas showed signs of recent harvest and careful preparation for winter storage. "This was Maria's special domain," Bear said quietly, his voice carrying the first note of sadness Sarah had detected since arriving at the homestead. "She had a gift for making things grow, for understanding exactly what each plant needed to thrive in our mountain conditions." The boys fell silent at this mention of their mother, their expressions showing the kind of respectful remembrance that suggested her memory remained a cherished part of their daily lives. Sarah realized that any woman who joined this family would need to respect and honor that memory rather than trying to replace or diminish it. "She must have been remarkable," Sarah said softly, "to help create all of this while raising 12 children." "She was," Bear agreed simply, "and she would have wanted her sons to have every advantage we could provide for them, including the kind of education that you could offer." The statement hung in the air between them, carrying implications that went far beyond mere educational arrangements. Sarah understood that she was being invited not just to teach the Thompson children, but to honor the memory of their mother by helping to ensure their continued growth and development. As they walked back toward the house in the gathering dusk, Sarah found herself overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was considering. The Thompson homestead represented a level of complexity and responsibility that dwarfed anything she had previously experienced, while the family itself presented challenges and opportunities that would test every skill and capability she possessed. Yet rather than feeling intimidated, she discovered that the prospect filled her with excitement and determination. This was exactly the kind of meaningful work she had always hoped to find, an opportunity to apply her abilities in circumstances where they could make a genuine difference in the lives of people she was already beginning to care about deeply. The evening meal that followed provided Sarah with her first experience of the Thompson family's daily routines, and she was struck by the combination of efficiency and warmth that characterized their interactions. The boys took turns helping with meal preparation and cleanup, working together with the kind of practiced cooperation that made even complex tasks appear effortless. Bear presided over the table with quiet authority, but Sarah noticed that he also listened carefully to his son's comments and concerns, treating even the youngest children's contributions with respect and attention. This was clearly a household where every member's voice mattered, where decisions were made collaboratively rather than imposed from above. Miss Mitchell, Caleb said during a pause in the conversation, what would our lessons be like if you decided to teach us? Would we have to sit at desks all day like the children in town? The question opened the door for Sarah to describe her educational philosophy in more detail, and she found herself engaged in a wide-ranging discussion about learning methods, subject areas, and the ways that formal education could complement rather than replace the practical knowledge the boys were already acquiring. Learning should be engaging and connected to your real lives, she explained. We could study mathematics while planning construction projects, explore science by investigating the natural processes you observe every day, and learn about different cultures and historical periods by reading literature that expands your understanding of how other people have faced challenges similar to yours. The boys listened with obvious interest, asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated both intellectual curiosity and a sophisticated understanding of their own educational needs. Sarah realized that these children were far more prepared for formal learning than many students she had taught, not despite their unconventional upbringing, but because of it. As the evening progressed, she found herself drawn into the natural rhythms of Thompson family life, helping with cleanup tasks, participating in conversations about plans for the following day, and observing the bedtime routines that ensured younger children received adequate rest while allowing older boys to continue with individual activities appropriate to their ages. When the time came for her to retire to the guest room, Sarah felt as though she had been given a privileged glimpse into a way of life that was both foreign and deeply appealing. The Thompson household functioned with the kind of genuine partnership and mutual support that she had always believed represented the best possibilities of family life, while still maintaining the individual character and capabilities that made each member valuable in their own right. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.